Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood before a group of young Japanese pilots at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines, his face grave in the dim light of the operations room. It was October 19, 1944, and the war situation for Imperial Japan had grown desperate. The Americans were pushing inexorably closer to the Japanese home islands, and conventional tactics had failed to stem the tide. Japan is in grave danger, Onishi told the assembled pilots, mostly in their early 20s. The salvation of our homeland rests with you. I ask you to take part in a special attack force that will crash dive your planes into enemy carriers. What do you think? The room fell silent. Then, a young lieutenant named Yukio Seki stepped forward. I understand. Please let me do it, he said, becoming the first volunteer for what would become known as the Kamikaze Corps, named after the divine wind that had destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet centuries earlier. Thus, began one of the most desperate military strategies of World War II, the deliberate suicide crashes of aircraft into Allied ships. The Kamikazes would become a symbol of Japanese fanaticism and sacrifice, striking terror into American sailors across the Pacific. For a time, Japanese military leaders genuinely believed these suicide attacks might turn the tide of the war. They were wrong. But understanding why requires examining how the strategy unfolded, the psychology behind it, and the decisive American response that ultimately rendered it ineffective. The concept of suicide attacks wasn't entirely new to Japanese military culture. The samurai tradition included seppuku, ritual suicide, and the willingness to die rather than face defeat or dishonor. During the war, Japanese soldiers had already demonstrated a willingness to fight to the death rather than surrender. But the systematic organization of suicide air attacks represented something unprecedented. The kamikaze strategy emerged from desperation. By late 1944, Japan's naval air force had been decimated. Many experienced pilots had been killed, and fuel shortages limited training for replacements. Meanwhile, American forces were advancing island by island toward Japan, supported by an increasingly dominant Navy and Air Force. Captain Motoharu Okamura, another early proponent of suicide attacks, explained the cold logic. In my opinion, there is only one way of assuring that our meager strength will be effective to a maximum degree. That is to organize suicide attack units composed of Zero fighters armed with 250-kilogram bombs, each plane to crash dive into an enemy carrier. Experienced pilots are no longer available. There is no alternative but this. The mathematics seemed compelling to Japanese strategists. A conventional air attack might involve 20 aircraft, with perhaps half lost in the process and only minor damage inflicted on enemy ships. But if those same planes were deliberately crashed into vital targets, each could potentially sink or severely damage an American vessel. One pilot, one plane, one ship. It seemed an efficient exchange. For the pilots themselves, the motivation was complex. While some genuinely volunteered, others felt immense social pressure. The Japanese military culture emphasized sacrifice for the emperor and nation. Many pilots came to see their deaths as meaningful, a way to defend their homeland and families while achieving a kind of immortality through an honorable death. Lieutenant Ichizo Hayashi, a kamikaze pilot who would die in the Philippines campaign, wrote in his diary, I am pleased to have the honor of having been chosen as a member of a special attack force that is on its way into battle. But I cannot help crying when I think of my dear parents. When I think of the many people who will read this letter after my death, I have a feeling that it is I, already dead, who am writing to you. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. 50 fighters, led by Lieutenant Seki, took off from Mabalacat, each carrying a 550-pound bomb. 4 of the planes struck American ships, including the USS St. Lo, which sank after a kamikaze hit its flight deck and triggered catastrophic internal explosions. The psychological impact was immediate. American sailors, accustomed to conventional aerial attacks where planes attempted to bomb ships and then escape, now faced an enemy that deliberately sought to crash into them. The sight of Japanese planes diving directly toward ships, ignoring anti-aircraft fire, was terrifying. You see this plane coming straight at you. No attempt to maneuver, just coming in a straight line. And you know the pilot's intent, remembered James Fahey, a seaman on the USS Montpelier. It does something to you inside. Your stomach drops, your mouth goes dry, and there's nowhere to run. The initial results seemed to validate the Japanese strategy. During the Philippines campaign, kamikazes damaged or sank dozens of Allied vessels at a fraction of the cost of conventional air attacks. Vice Admiral Onishi and other proponents argued that the psychological effect alone might force the Americans to reconsider their advance toward Japan. The Japanese military expanded the program, creating the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Divine Wind Special Attack Units. Training centers were established and ritual elements were added to reinforce the spiritual aspects of the sacrifice. Pilots wrote farewell letters, received ceremonial swords, and participated in sake drinking ceremonies before their final missions. By early 1945, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Okinawa, the last major stepping stone before Japan itself, the kamikaze strategy had evolved further. Beyond the Zero fighters, Japan developed purpose-built kamikaze aircraft like the Oka Cherry Blossom, essentially a manned rocket-powered bomb that could be released from a carrier aircraft. The Japanese High Command placed enormous hope in the kamikazes for the defense of Okinawa. Operation Tengo would involve hundreds of suicide aircraft along with the battleship Yamato on a one-way mission. Japanese propagandists spoke of miracle weapons that would yet turn the tide of war, with kamikazes featured prominently. What the Japanese military leadership failed to understand was how quickly the Americans would adapt to counter the kamikaze threat. And it was this adaptation, not any single battle or technology, that ultimately doomed the kamikaze strategy. The American response was multifaceted and demonstrated the tremendous industrial and intellectual resources the United States could bring to bear. It began with tactical adjustments, then expanded to new technologies, and culminated in a comprehensive defensive system that significantly blunted the kamikaze's effectiveness. The first response was to increase the quantity and coordination of anti-aircraft fire. Early kamikaze attacks had revealed gaps in ship defenses, particularly against aircraft approaching from low altitudes or out of the sun. The U.S. Navy began positioning ships in mutually supporting formations specifically designed to create overlapping fields of fire. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, directed, "Combat air patrols must be maintained at maximum practical distance from the force in order to destroy enemy planes before they reach the task force. Ships must be prepared to maneuver radically at high speeds to avoid hits." These tactical changes had immediate effects. Gunners became more adept at targeting planes on suicide runs, learning to aim for the pilot rather than the aircraft itself. Ships practiced coordinated maneuvers to present smaller targets or to disrupt a kamikaze's approach path, but the most significant American response came with the creation of radar picket stations, destroyers positioned up to 50 miles from the main fleet, equipped with advanced radar to detect incoming kamikaze raids at maximum distance. These picket ships, working with fighter direction officers, could vector combat air patrols to intercept kamikazes long before they reached the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan commanded the USS Laffey, a destroyer assigned to radar picket duty off Okinawa. "We knew we were bait," he later recalled. "Our job was to detect the kamikazes early and absorb the attacks that got through our combat air patrols." The system worked, though at terrible cost to the picket ships. On April 16, 1945, the Laffey was attacked by 22 kamikaze aircraft in an 80-minute period. Despite being hit by multiple planes and bombs, the destroyer's crew maintained disciplined anti-aircraft fire, shooting down 11 attackers. Though heavily damaged, the Laffey survived, a testament to both American damage control procedures and the growing effectiveness of anti-aircraft defenses. Technological innovations played a crucial role as well. The Navy accelerated the deployment of proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells, tiny radar sets that would detonate the shell when it came near an aircraft, rather than requiring a direct hit. This dramatically increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire. One analysis showed that proximity fuses increased the effectiveness of 5-inch guns against aircraft by at least 500%. At the same time, American industry was producing new classes of ships designed with kamikaze defense in mind. The fast combat support ship USS Caswell was launched after incorporating lessons from early kamikaze attacks, featuring dispersed gun mounts, improved firefighting systems, and compartmentalization to limit damage from penetrating strikes. Perhaps most importantly, the Americans greatly expanded their fighter coverage. F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair fighters, superior to most Japanese aircraft, were deployed in greater numbers, specifically to intercept kamikazes. Fighter direction officers using radar data became increasingly skilled at vectoring these aircraft to engage incoming raids at maximum distance from the fleet. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces, explained the approach. "We learned to hit them early and hit them hard. Every kamikaze shot down 50 miles out was one that wouldn't reach the fleet. It became a numbers game, and we had the numbers." The improved American defenses created a layered system: long-range radar detection, combat air patrols as the outer defensive ring, picket ships with their own anti-aircraft guns, and finally the concentrated firepower of the main fleet itself. With each layer, more kamikazes were destroyed before they could reach their targets. The turning point came during the Okinawa campaign in April-June 1945. The Japanese launched over 2,500 kamikaze sorties in 10 major raids, the largest suicide attack effort of the war. They called it Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, expecting it to devastate the American fleet. The results proved decisively that the kamikaze strategy had failed. Despite the massive effort, the overall effectiveness of the kamikazes had dramatically declined. During the Philippines campaign, approximately 27% of kamikaze aircraft had hit their targets. By Okinawa, that figure had dropped to under 11%. More importantly, the damage inflicted per successful hit had decreased as American damage control techniques improved. The radar picket destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley exemplified this turning point. On May 11, 1945, the Hadley and the destroyer USS Evans were attacked by 50 aircraft. Working with combat air patrols, the ships shot down 23 planes. The Hadley alone claimed 23 aircraft destroyed, including shared kills with fighters, although the ship was hit by a bomb, a kamikaze, and perhaps a second suicide aircraft. Despite severe damage, the Hadley didn't sink. After the war, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who commanded kamikaze units during the Okinawa campaign, wrote in his diary, "The results were not as good as expected. We should have coordinated better with conventional air attacks and used mass formations. But in the end, even perfect coordination might not have been enough against their defenses." The declining effectiveness of kamikazes represented a strategic failure for Japan. They had committed their remaining trained pilots and aircraft to a tactic that was yielding diminishing returns. Meanwhile, the psychological impact, the main strategic rationale, had backfired. Rather than demoralizing American forces, the kamikaze attacks hardened their resolve. Lieutenant John Popson, a naval officer who survived 3 kamikaze attacks, expressed a common sentiment. "After you've seen your buddies killed by these suicide planes, you don't feel much sympathy for the Japanese. If anything, it made us more determined to finish the job." By June 1945, American intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese military communications that revealed the truth. Japan's conventional and kamikaze air capabilities were nearly exhausted. The kamikazes had failed to stop the American advance, and Japan's military leadership knew it, though they continued to develop plans for the defense of the home islands using suicide tactics. These plans, dubbed Operation Ketsu Go, would have involved thousands of suicide aircraft, midget submarines, and even human-guided torpedoes against an Allied invasion force. But these weapons never got the chance to be deployed. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, coupled with the Soviet entry into the Pacific War, finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to accept surrender terms. In the final analysis, the kamikaze strategy failed for several key reasons. First, the Japanese overestimated the physical damage that suicide aircraft could inflict. While spectacular and terrifying, kamikaze hits often failed to sink modern warships designed with extensive compartmentalization and damage control systems. Second, they underestimated American industrial capacity. For every ship damaged or sunk, the United States could produce multiple replacements. The kamikaze was essentially trading one trained pilot and aircraft for damage that American shipyards could repair or replace within weeks. Third, the Japanese failed to anticipate how quickly and effectively the Americans would adapt their defenses. The combination of improved radar, proximity fuses, fighter direction, and coordinated anti-aircraft fire created a defense in depth that substantially reduced the kamikaze's effectiveness. Finally, The psychological impact worked against Japan's strategic interests. Rather than forcing the Americans to reconsider their advance toward Japan, the kamikaze attacks reinforced American perceptions of Japanese fanaticism and strengthened their determination to defeat Japan unconditionally. After the war, surviving kamikaze pilots offered insights into a campaign that had been shrouded in mystical rhetoric. Kazuo Nakajima, who had volunteered but never received orders for a mission, explained, "We were not suicidal fanatics. We were military men doing our duty. The politicians and military leaders who failed to end the war earlier, they bear the responsibility. For the Americans who faced the kamikazes, the experience left indelible memories." Samuel Eliot Morison, the official U.S. naval historian, wrote, "There was a difference between the kamikaze and all other weapons of war. When you fired a gun or dropped a bomb, you put your weapon, not yourself, in danger. But the kamikaze was human and weapon. In one, it was personal in a way other weapons were not. The kamikaze campaign stands as one of history's most extreme examples of sacrificing human life for military advantage. Over 3,800 Japanese airmen died in kamikaze attacks. Their sacrifice damaged or sank over 400 Allied vessels but failed to change the war's outcome. What Japan's military leaders had hoped would be a war-winning strategy became instead a symbol of desperate, futile sacrifice. In modern Kyushu, at the former kamikaze air base at Chiran, a peace museum now stands where young pilots once departed on their final missions. Among the artifacts are farewell letters that reveal the human tragedy behind the strategy. One pilot wrote, "I am happy to go, but I wish the task of devils did not fall to such gentle people." The kamikaze phenomenon teaches us about the limits of human sacrifice as a military strategy. Technology, adaptability, and industrial capacity proved more decisive than even the most extreme commitment to self-sacrifice. When American defensive innovations neutralized the kamikaze threat, the strategy that Japanese leaders had believed might save their empire was revealed for what it was: a tragic waste of young lives that could not change the fundamental reality of Japan's strategic situation. The lesson was clear and remains relevant today. No amount of sacrifice can overcome a fundamentally unsound strategic position. The kamikaze campaign failed not because Japanese pilots lacked courage or commitment, but because American adaptation rendered their sacrifice increasingly futile, a historical turning point that demonstrated how innovation and industrial might can overcome even the most determined human wave attacks. As a kamikaze's zero-hour poem poignantly expressed, "Today cherry blossoms fall, but the spiritual cherry blossoms of Yamato will bloom again in this land." The cherry blossoms did indeed bloom again in a peaceful Japan, but not through the sacrifice of young pilots, as military leaders had promised, but through the painful lessons of war and the eventual reconciliation that followed Japan's surrender. As American forces pushed closer to Japan's home islands in the summer of 1945, the Imperial Japanese military leadership doubled down on suicide tactics. Far from abandoning the kamikaze strategy after its declining effectiveness at Okinawa, they expanded it into a comprehensive doctrine that would mobilize the entire nation for a final, apocalyptic defense. Lieutenant General Korichika Anami, Japan's Minister of War, declared at an emergency meeting of the Supreme War Council, "We will prepare 20 million suicide attackers to meet the American invasion. Every Japanese will become a kamikaze." This was not mere rhetoric. Operation Katsugo, the plan for homeland defense, called for transforming Japan itself into a nation of kamikazes. Military planners reserved over 10,000 aircraft for suicide missions against an invasion fleet. Most were obsolete or training planes, but they didn't need to be sophisticated, just capable of carrying a bomb and crashing into a ship. At hidden airfields across Japan, mechanics modified civilian aircraft for suicide missions, stripping out everything but the essentials to make room for explosives. Flight instructors at training schools were ordered to focus solely on teaching takeoff and diving attacks, abandoning any curriculum on landing or navigation. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, who had served under Admiral Onishi during the formation of the first kamikaze units, inspected one such training facility near Fukuoka in July 1945. "The pilots are younger than ever," he noted in his diary. "Some appear to be only 16 or 17 with perhaps 30 hours of flight time. They can barely control their aircraft, but they only need to steer once, toward an American ship. Beyond aircraft, the Japanese military developed an entire arsenal of suicide weapons for the final defense. The Kaiten, Return to Heaven, was a manned torpedo that a pilot could steer directly into the hull of an enemy ship. Over 100 of these human-guided missiles were deployed, though they proved difficult to control and achieved minimal success compared to the resources invested in them. Lieutenant Yutaka Yokota, who trained Kaiten pilots, described their mindset. They called their training capsules coffins of steel, yet they climbed inside willingly. One young ensign told me, "I will sink an aircraft carrier to avenge my brothers who have fallen." The Shinyo, Ocean Shaker, was a suicide motorboat packed with explosives, designed to speed alongside American ships and detonate. Thousands were built and hidden in coastal caves around Japan, waiting for the invasion fleet. Their pilots, some as young as 15, received minimal training, often just enough to start the engine and aim at a target. Perhaps most disturbing were the Fukuryu, crouching dragons, suicide divers armed with mine-tipped poles. These swimmers, wearing diving apparatus, were expected to approach landing craft underwater and detonate their mines directly against the hulls, killing themselves in the process. Although 6,000 divers were trained, the program was hampered by inadequate equipment and the impracticality of the concept. At a naval training center in Yokosuka, Commander Toshiharu Kanata supervised Fukuryu training. "The young men accept their fate with remarkable calm," he wrote in a report to headquarters. "They know the chances of success are minimal, but they believe their sacrifice will inspire others." These increasingly desperate measures reflected a fundamental miscalculation by Japan's leadership. They believed that by demonstrating a willingness to sacrifice the entire nation rather than surrender, they could force the Americans to accept a negotiated peace that would preserve the imperial system and avoid occupation. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the father of the kamikaze strategy, articulated this belief in a memo to the Supreme War Council. "The Americans value life too highly. When they realize that every inch of Japanese soil will cost them thousands of casualties, they will reconsider the demand for unconditional surrender." This fundamental misunderstanding of American psychology proved catastrophic. Far from being intimidated by Japanese suicide tactics, American military planners viewed them as evidence that the Japanese leadership was increasingly irrational and dangerous, reinforcing the conviction that only unconditional surrender and occupation could ensure lasting peace. Behind the scenes, American intelligence was tracking the buildup of kamikaze forces with growing alarm. Through decoded Japanese communications and reconnaissance flights, they assembled a detailed picture of the massive suicide attack force being prepared. The potential casualties from an invasion, opposed by thousands of kamikazes, were projected to be staggering. Military analyst Captain Ellis Zacharias prepared a report for the Joint Chiefs of Staff that concluded, "An invasion of Japan could cost between 250,000 and 500,000 American casualties based on the expected scale of kamikaze resistance. The Japanese appear willing to sacrifice millions of their own people in a futile defense." These projected casualties became a significant factor in President Truman's decision to authorize the use of atomic weapons. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945. Coupled with the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on August 8, finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to intervene directly in favor of surrender. In the early morning hours of August 15th, as Japan prepared to announce its surrender, a final drama related to the kamikaze strategy unfolded. A group of young army officers attempted a coup to prevent the surrender broadcast, believing that Japan should fight to the death rather than accept defeat. They planned to continue the war with mass kamikaze attacks, regardless of the emperor's decision. The coup failed, but it demonstrated how deeply the kamikaze ethos had penetrated the military mindset. Admiral Onishi, upon learning of Japan's surrender, did not try to flee or evade responsibility. Instead, in keeping with the spirit he had demanded of his kamikaze pilots, he committed ritual suicide. Before plunging the blade into his abdomen, he wrote a note of apology to the pilots he had sent to their deaths. "I wish to express my deep appreciation to the souls of the brave special attackers. They fought and died valiantly with faith in our ultimate victory. In death, I wish to atone for my part in the failure to achieve that victory and apologize to the spirits of the dead, for the thousands of kamikaze pilots who were still waiting for their Final missions. When the surrender came, the news brought conflicting emotions. Many had psychologically prepared for death and now faced the challenge of living in a defeated Japan under American occupation. Takehiko Ena was one such pilot. At a kamikaze base in southern Japan, he had written his final letters and prepared mentally for his mission when the surrender was announced. "I had already died in my mind," he later recalled. "To suddenly have to live again, it was like being reborn into a different world." Some pilots refused to believe the surrender and had to be physically restrained by their commanders from taking off on unauthorized missions. Others experienced profound relief, though few would admit it publicly at the time. Toshimitsu Imaizumi, another kamikaze pilot who never flew his final mission, described the moment. "When our commander told us the war was over, there was complete silence in the room. No one cheered. That would have dishonored those who had already gone. But I saw tears in many eyes, and I knew they were not all tears of shame." The Americans were equally stunned by the scale of the kamikaze preparations they discovered during the occupation. At hidden airfields across Japan, they found thousands of aircraft modified for suicide attacks, often with minimal instrumentation and crude arrangements for attaching explosives. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, investigating Japanese air capabilities after the surrender, reported, "The scale of the planned kamikaze defense exceeds our most pessimistic intelligence estimates. Had an invasion been necessary, our losses might have been even worse than projected." American occupation authorities made a point of dismantling the physical infrastructure of the kamikaze program, destroying modified aircraft and specialized equipment, but they faced a more complex challenge in addressing the psychological and cultural aspects that had enabled the strategy. The occupation administration under General Douglas MacArthur recognized that the kamikaze phenomenon was not simply the product of military fanaticism, but was rooted in aspects of Japanese culture that had been manipulated by wartime leadership, particularly the concepts of self-sacrifice and absolute loyalty to the emperor. In a memo to Washington, MacArthur wrote, "We must transform Japanese society in ways that preserve its unique strengths while removing the elements that made possible such self-destructive military strategies. This requires cultural change, not just disarmament." The American approach focused on democratization, demilitarization, and educational reform. State Shinto, which had provided religious justification for sacrifice in service to the emperor, was disestablished. The emperor himself was required to renounce his divine status. School textbooks were rewritten to emphasize critical thinking rather than obedience to authority. For many former kamikaze pilots who survived, the post-war years brought difficult adjustments. Some found it impossible to speak about their experiences for decades. Others channeled their energies into Japan's economic reconstruction, applying the same dedication they had once directed towards self-sacrifice to rebuilding their nation's prosperity. Yasuo Kuwahara, who had volunteered for kamikaze service but never flew a mission, became a successful businessman in post-war Japan. "The same spirit that made us willing to die for our country could be used to live for our country," he explained in a 1985 interview. The determination and focus required are not so different. Some former pilots sought reconciliation with their former enemies. In 1962, Saburo Sakai, a renowned Japanese fighter ace who had trained kamikaze pilots, visited the United States and met with American naval veterans. "We were all young men doing what we believed was our duty," Sakai told the Americans. "Now we have a duty to ensure such a war never happens again." American attitudes toward kamikaze pilots also evolved over time. Initial reactions of fear and anger gradually gave way to a more nuanced understanding. Many American veterans came to distinguish between the tactics they had faced and the individual pilots who, often very young, had been caught in a desperate strategy not of their own making. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who had commanded destroyer squadrons against kamikaze attacks, expressed this perspective in his memoirs. "I came to respect the courage of the kamikaze pilots, even while I detested the leaders who sent them to their deaths. They were brave men caught in a terrible war, just as we were. For Japanese society as a whole, the legacy of the kamikaze phenomenon remained complex and emotionally charged. The pilots were alternately viewed as tragic victims of militarism, symbols of misguided patriotism, or embodiments of a particular kind of Japanese spiritual strength, depending on one's political perspective and generation. In the 1960s, as Japan experienced rapid economic growth and increasing prosperity, public discussion of the kamikaze phenomenon was often subdued. Many families who had lost sons to suicide missions preferred not to speak of their sacrifices in a society focused on rebuilding and looking forward. This changed somewhat in the 1970s, as a new generation began to ask questions about the war. Books, documentaries, and museum exhibitions started to examine the kamikaze phenomenon more openly, though still with considerable sensitivity to the feelings of survivors and families. At the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where Japan's war dead are commemorated, kamikaze pilots receive special recognition. This has remained controversial, particularly among Japan's neighbors who suffered during the war and view the shrine as a symbol of unrepentant militarism. By contrast, the Cheer and Peace Museum in southern Kyushu offers a more nuanced perspective. Located near the airbase from which many kamikaze missions were launched, it preserves the pilots' farewell letters, personal belongings, and photographs in a context that emphasizes the human tragedy of young lives lost rather than glorifying their sacrifice. Museum director Takeshi Kawatoko explained the approach. "We do not celebrate or condemn. We simply try to help visitors understand the reality these young men faced, the choices they made or had made for them, and the lessons we can learn about war and peace." Among the most powerful artifacts are the pilots' final letters home, which often reveal complex emotions behind the official facade of willing sacrifice. Many express concern for their parents' grief, appreciation for their upbringing, and hopes for Japan's future, alongside declarations of patriotic dedication. One letter from 23-year-old Lieutenant Toshio Anazawa to his pregnant wife reads in part, "When you look at the cherry blossoms at Ueno Park, please think of me. I will be the wind that caresses your hair. I will be watching you and our child from above." These personal items humanize the pilots in ways that purely military or political analyses cannot. They remind us that behind every historical phenomenon are individual human beings with hopes, fears, and dreams, even in circumstances as extreme as the kamikaze campaign. Military historians have continued to debate the strategic impact of the kamikaze tactic. While it clearly failed to change the outcome of the war, some argue that it did influence American planning in significant ways, particularly regarding the potential invasion of Japan. Naval historian Dr. James Stevenson contends, "The kamikaze campaign may have been the most cost-effective tactic available to Japan by 1945, given their circumstances. Though it couldn't win the war, it extracted a higher price in ships and personnel than conventional attacks could have, using far fewer resources." This affected American calculations about the potential cost of invasion. Others point out that the resources devoted to kamikaze operations, including valuable aviation fuel and trained pilots, might have been better used in homeland defense or protecting essential shipping. By committing to a tactic that was ultimately self-defeating, Japan accelerated its own collapse. Military ethicist Professor Michael Walzer has examined the kamikaze phenomenon in terms of the moral frameworks of warfare. The kamikaze strategy existed at the intersection of military desperation and a cultural context that could frame suicide attacks as honorable. But it crossed a fundamental line by treating human beings as expendable weapons rather than as moral agents. The strategic lessons of the kamikaze campaign continue to influence military thinking today, particularly regarding asymmetric warfare tactics. The Japanese experience demonstrated that suicide attacks can be tactically effective in the short term but strategically counterproductive if they provoke a stronger response or fail to break the enemy's will. Admiral James Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, observed in a military journal, "The kamikaze phenomenon shows that enemies willing to die in the attack present unique challenges, but it also demonstrates that technical and tactical adaptation can substantially mitigate even the most committed suicide tactics." Perhaps the most important legacy of the kamikaze phenomenon lies in its demonstration of how dangerous it is when a nation's leadership becomes willing to sacrifice its youth in increasingly desperate measures rather than accept strategic reality. The kamikaze campaign represented not military innovation but the failure of Japan's strategic leadership to recognize when the war was lost and take steps to end it before further sacrifice became futile. In 2001, one of the last surviving kamikaze pilots, Tadamasa Itatsu, spoke to a gathering of university students in Tokyo about his experiences. Asked whether he had been afraid, he replied, "Of course I was afraid. We were all afraid, but more than death, we feared shame. We feared letting down our families, our comrades, our emperor. Now I understand that the greater courage would have been to question the orders that sent so many young men to die unnecessarily." As the number of surviving kamikaze pilots dwindled in the early 21st century, historians worked to record their testimonies before they were lost forever. These accounts revealed greater complexity in the kamikaze program than earlier studies had suggested, particularly regarding the degree of volunteerism among the pilots. Emiko Onuki-Tierney, an anthropologist who studied the diaries and letters of kamikaze pilots, discovered that many were university students with liberal or even pacifist leanings who felt compelled by social pressure and the circumstances of war to volunteer. "They were not the fanatical warriors of propaganda," she wrote, "but often sensitive young men caught in a national tragedy. Some pilots had joined the program to protect their families from the shame that would come if they refused. Others believed the propaganda that their sacrifice would help achieve a negotiated peace that would save Japanese civilians from invasion. Many simply saw no alternative in a military system where refusing orders was unthinkable. The letters they left behind reveal young men who loved poetry, philosophy, and cherished memories of home. They dreamed of futures they would never see, wrote of cherry blossoms they would never again witness in bloom, and expressed quiet doubts they could share only on paper. They were sons, brothers, students, and friends before they became weapons. A transformation that represented not the triumph of Japanese spirit as their leaders claimed, but the tragedy of a nation that had lost its way. In the end, the kamikaze strategy failed not because American sailors lacked courage or Japanese pilots lacked commitment, but because no amount of sacrifice can overcome fundamental strategic realities. The technological innovations and tactical adaptations developed by American forces rendered even the ultimate sacrifice increasingly futile. This lesson, that determination alone cannot overcome material disadvantage, and that leadership has a moral obligation to recognize when further sacrifice serves no purpose, remains perhaps the most important legacy of a campaign that consumed thousands of young lives without changing the war's inevitable outcome. Today, as the cherry blossoms fall each spring in Japan, they serve as a quiet reminder of lives cut short, not by divine wind, but by human decisions that placed national pride above human life and desperate strategy above rational assessment of reality. The kamikazes remain powerful symbols, not of the glory of self-sacrifice, but of the profound human cost when nations choose destruction over acceptance of difficult truths. The end.